Most of my practice over the last 10 years has been focused on complex, white-collar criminal litigation, representing business people and professionals who have been charged with crimes in federal court. I've done this for 20+ years, never had a case like this. I will never have another one like this, that's for sure. Protesters have not been a core part of my practice throughout the years. But I got a call from the Federal Public Defender's Office about representing an individual in what they call a standby capacity. This was an individual involved with a refuge takeover, and we think there's going to be another case and it's going to be a much bigger deal. And I said, all right, well, I'm willing to get involved. My perception of this takeover was similar to everyone else. You know, these guys were sort of right-wing terrorist lunatics. You know, I bought the narrative that was being presented by the media at that time.
I came on the case in June. The trial was set to start in September. It's not a lot of time. The government was still producing, terabytes of discovery.
We've never been asked to get ready for a piece of litigation like that fast in federal court. Anna Brown, she was the district court judge responsible for overseeing this whole thing. And then we had 3 federal prosecutors, and then we had 7 defendants that ultimately went to trial.
Complicating that is the fact that 2 or 3 of the individual defendants opting to represent themselves pro se, at least in part. Ryan Bundy represented himself pretty much pro se throughout the trial.
There were realistically, when we started this whole case, 10-year kind of prison sentences on the table for someone like Ammon. When you're dealing with the most powerful government in the history of human civilization, the most extensive law enforcement apparatus that's ever been constructed, you ain't gonna win a lot.
They have all the power, all the resources. As much as we like to think there's a presumption of innocence, there's actually this machine that makes it a presumption of guilt.
I viewed it as pretty hopeless. Judge Brown told me no one should ever be acquitted in her courtroom. It would be such a series of catastrophic errors before somebody were to get into my courtroom that would be acquitted. She spoke those words to me. It was an amazing thing to watch. None of it made any sense. Insanely disorganized examinations that went nowhere, and these days in court that you would just be like, what happened?
You can't take anything for granted, and you need to rebut every piece of evidence that the government is presenting in its favor.
I think he was just trying to survive because he expected to get a set-over in the case and have sufficient time to prepare. And so when he didn't, he just went into this kind of trench mode, this sort of trench warfare mode of like, okay, I'm just gonna slow everything down until I can kind of catch up to the trial. It really, I think, interestingly enough, sort of dissipated the strength of the government's case. And even for the jury, because I think the jury got an opportunity to understand fundamentally what was motivating these men and women to do this.
There was a really heavy emphasis on guns and the amount of guns at the refuge and how much ammunition they found, how many spent shell casings they found. We kept asking, okay, but who brought these guns to the refuge? And they said, well, it doesn't matter, because they had my client on tape where he said, we've got a place for you, there's food, there's shelter, bring your guns. Well, they said, ha, that's the key. There was nothing illegal at all about the gun ownership that was at the refuge. They found nothing illegal. There was no unregistered gun. There was no gun that ever turned up, be associated with any crime. It was just, well, you had guns there.
There's nothing criminal or unlawful about possessing a weapon or exercising your Second Amendment rights in the context of exercising your First Amendment rights. And I think that was extremely important to us in the context of this trial because it gave validity to this idea that, well, you don't just have First Amendment rights, you have Second Amendment rights. And isn't there an interplay between those two that's valid? It forced the federal government to take them more seriously, which gave them sufficient space to have media come, to have people coming, to have exposure for these ideas, which is what they really wanted. The only significant charge was the charge of conspiracy to prevent the employees of the BLM or the Fish and Wildlife from doing their official duties through force, intimidation, or threat. The jury wanted evidence of one of those guys during all those thousands of hours they were standing on camera to look into a camera and go, hey, BLM people, if you come back here, we're shooting your ass. That wasn't what these guys were interested in. They couldn't have cared less. So that really kind of limited the government's narrative, I think. It made it harder for them to portray their employees as victims.
Mr. Bundy testified as to the adverse possession. Why what they did was not a conspiracy.
Media may have made him a leader of something, and I think other individuals around him made him a leader of something, but really all he wanted to do was help the Hammonds.
Mr. Bundy's testimony was a critical part of the evidence that was presented. It was raw, it was emotional.
That was effective in the context of our trial.
So we come to the end of the trial. The jury's been out for several days. Of course, when the jury comes in, we stand up and they come in and they have the verdict form. Mr. Bundy came first, and count 1, conspiracy.
The sweetest words you will ever hear in a federal criminal trial, and that's the words not guilty. An astonishing result. Total vindication that nearly all of us thought was impossible. I mean, the coolest thing about this trial was to be able to speak to one of the jurors and have that juror tell me that our verdict wasn't based on sympathy. It wasn't based on the fact that we liked or didn't like these guys. It wasn't based on anything other than the fact that we had a set of instructions to follow and the government didn't prove it.
It's one of the best moments you get as a lawyer because that's your job, is to present the truth. It's a wave of emotion, but it's a wave of emotion that you don't see.
All the times I've been successful at trial, I've been successful because I found some emotional fulcrum in the trial, something in my client or in the case that I believed in. It's not okay to take over a federal facility with guns. You know, if that's your goal, to go in there and prevent these people from really working and all of that kind of thing, then you deserve to be convicted. But that wasn't their goal.
I stand up to raise the issue of Mr. Bundy's status in custody.
Marcus is standing up going, you know, I have a matter for the court, and he starts talking to the judge about his client being released because he's been acquitted.
He'd been in custody for 10 months at this point on charges that he was just acquitted of. I asked the court, well, you know, when you're acquitted, you're released. You don't have to go back to prison to check out. She said, well, he's released as far as I'm concerned. And then she says, but the marshals may have something about it. No, and I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. If they're gonna keep him in custody based on the Nevada case, well, then show me what gives them that authority.
He wasn't getting his client released. There wasn't any traction to anything that he was doing, but it was Marcus's shtick, and he'd been doing it for 8 weeks. And so the judge, you know, I remember her saying to him, Mr. Mumford, stop yelling at me, and don't ever yell at me again.
All these marshals converge around me. They never told me why. I remember at that point raising my hands and says, hold on, guys. We're still in the middle of this issue. I remember that marshal said something like, we'll come to the 4th floor or come to whatever floor it was, and we'll show you the order. And I said, no, you bring it here. You bring it here. He's released. If you have it, you know, show it to me.
In the meantime, I'm basically 10 feet behind him. And he's kind of turned one way, and there's marshals coming towards him, and then there's other marshals coming from behind him, and they did not look well-intentioned.
Out of the corner of my eye, I see this one marshal approaching, and they kind of take me by my shirt, and they're like, stop resisting, stop resisting. I'm like, guys, I'm not resisting.
I'm not resisting. And I hear somebody yell, stop resisting. And I'm just thinking to myself, man, that never ends well.
But ultimately, they tackle me. I'm on my belly, face down on the ground, you know, taking my head and pounding it into the carpet. And then I hear them talking about the taser. Sure enough, they take out the taser and they hit me with it.
Really abusive overreaction to a situation that was highly charged and highly emotional.
I remember when they stood me up, was the first time I looked over at the judge. And I remember thinking to myself, you've been here the whole time and you let this happen? And then the authorities, escort me out of the courtroom into a holding tank.
We all end up at Patty's having cocktails. We get a text message from someone at like 8:30. Marcus has been released from the jail, and he's gonna come over and meet us. And so he walks into the bar, and I mean, he looks like somebody that's just been in a fight. And he just walks over to the table and I'm sitting out, and he just slams his hand on the table. He goes, "Not guilty, motherfucker!" And that's when I knew Marcus was gonna be all right.
The report that I got later was that my staff went down to the fourth floor and said, "Okay, you got the order, let's see it." And the marshal went into the office, and about 20 minutes to a half hour later came out and said, "I don't know if we lost it or we don't have it, but I don't have it. I can't find it." Turns out they didn't have the order, but they kept Mr. Bundy in custody. How? They put his lawyer in custody.